World War I, often called the Great War, marked a decisive turning point in modern history. Between 1914 and 1918, an entire generation of soldiers and civilians experienced destruction and transformation on a scale never before imagined. The conflict redrew political borders, toppled empires, altered economies, and introduced industrialized warfare that permanently changed humanity's relationship with technology and violence. Although the war officially began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, its deeper origins stretched back decades, rooted in nationalism, imperial ambition, militarism, and the entangling system of alliances that defined European diplomacy at the turn of the 20th century. Understanding World War I requires tracing how those forces collided and how their collision engulfed not only Europe, but also Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Europe in 1914 was a continent of both extraordinary progress and profound tension. Industrialization had created new wealth and global networks of trade. Yet that same industrial might fueled a race for colonies and military supremacy. Britain still ruled a vast empire, priding itself on naval dominance and global commerce. France, recovering from the humiliation of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, sought both security and revenge against Germany. The newly unified German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was rapidly expanding its economy, population, and military capability. Italy struggled to find its place among the great powers, while Austria, Hungary, and Russia presided over multi-ethnic empires whose internal divisions threatened stability. Across the continent, national pride and fear intertwined. Governments believed survival depended on strength, alliances, and preparedness. Militarism intensified those anxieties. Advances in industry made possible mass production of weapons, ships, and artillery. Standing armies grew ever larger, and universal conscription became the norm in most European states. War planning was professionalized, detailed down to railway timetables. The German General Staff developed the Schlieffen Plan, a preemptive strategy to defeat France quickly in the West before turning east against Russia. France devised Plan 17, envisioning an offensive through Alsace-Lorraine to reclaim lost provinces. Such blueprints assumed that war was inevitable and that the side mobilizing fastest would win. Newspapers, novels, and school curricula glorified martial virtue, reinforcing the idea that conflict was not only necessary but also ennobling. Imperial rivalries added another layer of tension. European powers competed fiercely for colonies, markets, and resources. Britain and France dominated Africa and parts of Asia, while Germany's late entry into imperialism bred resentment. Crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911 brought Europe to the brink of war as Germany challenged French interests and Britain backed its ally. Beyond Europe, Japan's rise after its victory over Russia in 1905 introduced new power dynamics in East Asia. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, long regarded as the sick man of Europe, struggled to maintain control over its territories, drawing the attention of both Austria-Hungary and Russia, each seeking influence in the Balkans. The Balkans were the tinderbox of Europe. After the decline of Ottoman authority, newly independent states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania, sought to expand. Russia positioned itself as protector of Slavic peoples, especially the Serbs, while Austria-Hungary aimed to suppress nationalism that threatened its own cohesion. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13 further destabilized the region, producing victors and losers nursing deep grievances. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo in June 1914, he entered a landscape charged with nationalist tension. His assassination by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb associated with the Black Hand movement, triggered a diplomatic crisis whose consequences the leaders of Europe neither anticipated nor could control. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, drafted with German encouragement, demanded concessions that no sovereign nation could accept fully. When Serbia's response fell short, Vienna declared war on 28 July 1914. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. And when German troops invaded neutral Belgium, Britain entered the conflict. In less than a week, Europe's alliance system transformed a regional dispute into a continental war. Millions of men were mobilized in a matter of days, and trains carried soldiers toward fronts that few yet understood would consume them for years. The initial expectation of a swift victory soon collapsed. Germany's invasion of Belgium and northern France met fierce resistance. The Schlieffen Plan faltered at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, when French and British forces halted the advance outside Paris. Both sides began digging defensive trenches, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. What emerged was trench warfare, a static, grinding struggle defined by artillery barrages, machine gun fire, mud, disease, and staggering casualties for minimal territorial gain. The Western Front became a landscape of devastation, where life in the trenches meant constant danger, monotony, and psychological strain. On the Eastern Front, the war was more fluid. Vast distances prevented the establishment of continuous trench lines. Russia mobilized quickly, invading East Prussia and Austria-Hungary, but suffered catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff became national heroes by encircling and destroying entire Russian armies. Yet the Eastern Front drained resources and manpower, and despite occasional successes, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. In the south, Austria-Hungary struggled against Serbia and Italy, while the Ottoman Empire, joining the Central Powers later that year, opened new theaters of conflict in the Middle East and the Caucasus. The human experience of war quickly diverged from the romantic visions that had accompanied mobilization. Soldiers endured constant shelling, lice-infested trenches, and the ever-present stench of decay. No man's land, the barren stretch between opposing trenches, was littered with corpses and twisted metal. Attempts to break the stalemate, such as offensives at Ypres, Verdun, and the Somme, produced appalling losses measured in hundreds of thousands for gains of a few kilometers. Industrialization meant that killing was mechanized. Machine guns mowed down waves of attackers. Artillery shells pulverized landscapes and bodies alike. And in 1915, the Germans introduced poison gas, adding a new dimension of horror. The war's technological innovations, tanks, aircraft, submarines, flamethrowers, promised breakthroughs, but often only multiplied destruction. Civilians, too, became participants and victims. Total war blurred the line between front and home front. Governments mobilized entire economies to support military needs, directing production of munitions, food, and transport. Women entered factories, offices, and hospitals in unprecedented numbers, taking roles previously closed to them. Propaganda became a weapon as powerful as artillery. Posters urged enlistment, demonized the enemy, and promoted sacrifice for the nation. Censorship limited dissent, while rationing and shortages reshaped daily life. In occupied regions, Belgium, northern France, Poland, civilians suffered deportations, forced labor, and reprisals. The war's reach extended beyond the battlefield, redefining citizenship, gender roles, and the relationship between state and individual. The war at sea played a critical strategic role. Britain's Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany, cutting off imports of food and raw materials. The blockade contributed to severe shortages and malnutrition within the Central Powers, but it also provoked Germany to adopt unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats targeted Allied and neutral shipping alike, aiming to starve Britain into submission. The sinking of the British liner Lusitania in 1915, with more than 1,000 civilian deaths, including Americans, sparked international outrage and strained U.S.-German relations. Naval warfare became a contest of endurance and innovation, with new technologies such as depth charges and hydrophones emerging in response to the submarine threat. By 1916, the optimism of early campaigns had evaporated. The Battle of Verdun, launched by Germany in February, aimed to bleed France white. It became a 10-month ordeal, costing over 700,000 casualties, with negligible territorial change. The Battle of the Somme, initiated by Britain to relieve pressure on Verdun, introduced tanks and massive artillery barrages, but resulted in similarly devastating losses. The term "war of attrition" entered public discourse, reflecting a grim reality. Victory would come not through maneuver, but through exhaustion of the enemy's capacity to fight. As soldiers rotated through the trenches, morale fluctuated between stoic endurance and despair. Letters, diaries, and poetry from the front reveal a spectrum of emotions: patriotism, anger, fear, and disillusionment that defined a generation. By 1916, the cumulative strain of the conflict began to test the endurance of every nation involved. The optimism that had driven men to enlist 2 years earlier had long since vanished. Instead, a grim determination settled over Europe's capitals. Victory had to come, but no one could yet see how. Governments expanded control over industry, labor, and information, creating what some historians later called the First Total War. Every aspect of society was directed toward sustaining armies that numbered in the millions. Rationing became widespread, and wartime propaganda urged citizens to tighten their belts, buy war bonds, and distrust those who questioned the national effort. Yet, behind the patriotic slogans lay exhaustion, hunger, and growing skepticism about whether any of the sacrifices would truly bring a better world. The year's most notorious engagement, the Battle of Verdun, epitomized this new phase of attrition. Verdun was not chosen for strategic reasons so much as for symbolism. It represented French national pride. The German commander, Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that if France defended it to the last man, he could destroy the French army by sheer bloodletting. From February to December 1916, German and French forces hurled millions of shells at one another in a confined landscape of forts, hills, and trenches. The French rallying cry, "They shall not pass," became a symbol of endurance. Yet the cost was staggering. Roughly 300,000 dead and over twice that number wounded. Entire villages were obliterated. The soil around Verdun remained poisoned for decades. When the battle finally subsided, neither side had achieved a decisive advantage, but both were drained of strength. The same year witnessed the Battle of the Somme, launched by Britain and France partly to divert German forces from Verdun. It opened on July 1, 1916, after a week-long artillery bombardment intended to annihilate German defenses. When the whistles blew and British soldiers climbed from their trenches, many were cut down almost instantly by machine gun fire. That first day alone cost the British Army nearly 60,000 casualties, the heaviest single-day loss in its history. Over the next 4 months, the Allies advanced a mere handful of miles, at the price of more than 1 million casualties on both sides. The Somme became synonymous with futility. Yet it also marked the gradual maturation of Britain's mass army and the first appearance of tanks. Primitive, but hinting at future possibilities. By the end of 1916, the war had consumed men and material on an unprecedented scale, with little to show but lists of the dead. Far from the Western Front, the conflict continued to expand. In Eastern Europe, Russia's immense resources of manpower could not compensate for poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and industrial weakness. The Brusilov offensive of mid-1916 briefly stunned the Central Powers, inflicting heavy losses on Austria-Hungary, but it exhausted Russian reserves and exposed the empire's logistical limits. Food shortages, inflation, and the sheer burden of casualties eroded public confidence in Tsar Nicholas II's government. Across the empire, strikes and protests signaled deeper unrest that would soon erupt into revolution. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire fought on multiple fronts. The British and French sought to weaken Ottoman control through campaigns in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Dardanelles. The Gallipoli expedition of 1915–16, championed by Winston Churchill, ended in failure and heavy Allied casualties, but it stirred nationalist sentiment in Turkey and Australia alike. At the same time, British officials encouraged an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, promising post-war independence that was later compromised by imperial agreements. The war in the Middle East thus intertwined with the ambitions of empires old and new, laying groundwork for conflicts that would outlast the armistice. The naval war also entered a new phase. Germany's decision in early 1917 to resume unrestricted submarine warfare aimed to cut Britain off from overseas supplies before American intervention could tip the balance. German U-boats sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied and neutral shipping each month, bringing Britain to the brink of starvation. Yet the policy proved a strategic blunder. It enraged the United States, already provoked by the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico should the U.S. enter the war. When President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on April 6, 1917, he framed the conflict as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Although American forces would take time to mobilize, their eventual arrival promised fresh manpower and industrial resources to the weary Allies. Russia, meanwhile, was imploding. The February Revolution of 1917 forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government tried to continue the war, but soldiers and civilians alike were exhausted and disillusioned. In October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power with the slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread." One of their first acts was to negotiate an end to hostilities. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, removed Russia from the war at a huge territorial cost, but allowed the Bolsheviks to consolidate power at home. For Germany, the treaty freed divisions from the Eastern Front for a final offensive in the West, a gamble that would ultimately fail. As 1917 progressed, the strain of war reached breaking points across Europe. In France, mutinies spread after the disastrous Nivelle offensive, where promises of a quick breakthrough gave way to massive losses. Soldiers refused to attack, chanting "enough," though they largely remained defensive rather than revolutionary. General Philippe Pétain restored order through reforms and limited concessions, emphasizing defense until American help arrived. In Britain, conscription had been introduced, censorship tightened, and dissenters imprisoned. Yet morale, though shaken, held firm, sustained by a sense that defeat would mean catastrophe. The entry of the United States into the war altered not only military balance, but also the psychological landscape. For allies battered by years of stalemate, American involvement symbolized renewed hope. The U.S. mobilization was a colossal effort. Within a year, over 2 million American soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Force under General John J. Pershing, were training in Europe. American industry provided food, munitions, and loans that kept the Allied war machine running. While initially inexperienced, American troops brought energy and numerical superiority that would prove decisive in 1918. At the same time, the world beyond Europe was drawn deeper into the conflict. Colonies supplied troops and resources. Indians, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Africans, and Caribbean soldiers fought in distant theaters, often without the recognition they deserved. The war accelerated social change within these colonies, sowing seeds of nationalism and questioning of imperial hierarchies. For the first time, global interdependence was visible not just through trade, but through shared trauma. Technological innovation continued at a frantic pace. Aircraft, once used mainly for reconnaissance, became tools of bombing and dogfighting. Pilots such as the German Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, became folk heroes even as aerial warfare grew more lethal. Tanks improved in reliability and numbers, offering glimpses of mobile warfare's future. On the ground, creeping barrages, stormtrooper tactics, and improved coordination between infantry and artillery reflected a painful learning process. Yet each new method merely raised the scale of destruction. The war had become a test of endurance among industrial systems rather than battlefield genius. By the end of 1917, the Central Powers appeared both triumphant and desperate. Russia's collapse seemed to vindicate German strategy, but starvation, strikes, and political unrest haunted the home front. Austria-Hungary was fracturing along ethnic lines, while the Ottoman Empire bled from multiple defeats. In Britain and France, civilians faced shortages and grief, but democratic institutions survived. The question was no longer who could win quickly, but who could outlast the collapse of morale, economy, and will. By the beginning of 1918, Europe stood on the edge of exhaustion. Every great power had sacrificed enormous resources, and every population lived under the weight of grief and deprivation. Yet the leaders of the Central Powers, especially Germany's High Command, saw one final opportunity. With Russia out of the war, German forces could be shifted westward, potentially overwhelming the Allies before American troops arrived in force. The plan, conceived by Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg, aimed to deliver a decisive blow through a series of spring offensives that would shatter Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. The coming months would determine the fate of Europe. The first of these offensives, Operation Michael, began in March 1918. German troops struck through the Somme region, exploiting dense fog and new infiltration tactics developed by stormtroopers, small, fast-moving units that bypassed strong points to attack communication and supply centers. The offensive achieved stunning initial success, driving the British Fifth Army into retreat and advancing farther than any side had managed in years. Yet success bred overextension. German logistics failed to keep pace with the rapid advance, and exhausted troops paused to loot captured Allied supplies rather than press forward. Reinforcements were scarce, and the Allies, though shaken, regrouped. The offensive lost momentum before it could deliver a decisive victory. Subsequent German assaults in Flanders and Champagne repeated the pattern: initial breakthroughs followed by attrition and collapse. Each push drained Germany's dwindling reserves of men and material. By summer, over 1 million German soldiers were casualties of these operations. At home, the population faced hunger and despair as the British naval blockade strangled imports. Workers' strikes and calls for peace multiplied. In the military hierarchy, morale crumbled as soldiers recognized the futility of continued attacks. Ludendorff himself began to oscillate between optimism and despair, sensing that the window for victory was closing fast. Meanwhile, the Allies were reorganizing. Under the newly appointed French commander-in-chief, Ferdinand Foch, coordination between British, French, and American forces improved significantly. The arrival of large numbers of fresh American troops bolstered morale and manpower. By mid-1918, the balance had shifted decisively. In July, at the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allies successfully repelled the last major German offensive. The counterattack, spearheaded by French and American divisions, marked the beginning of a relentless advance that would push the Central Powers back on all fronts. The Allied 100 Days Offensive, launched in August 1918, demonstrated how far the art of war had evolved since 1914. Coordinated use of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry broke through German defenses with unprecedented effectiveness. At Amiens, the opening battle stunned the German command, prompting Ludendorff to call it the Black Day of the German Army. Unlike the grinding stalemates of earlier years, these offensives advanced steadily, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of equipment. German forces, demoralized and hungry, retreated toward their own borders. For the first time in the war, the Allies could envision total victory. As the front collapsed, revolution stirred in Germany. Strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies spread through naval bases and industrial centers. Soldiers refused orders to attack, and workers' councils, modeled after the Russian Soviets, demanded peace and political reform. In late October, sailors at Kiel mutinied, setting off a chain reaction that brought the monarchy to the brink. Kaiser Wilhelm II, isolated and blamed for disaster, fled to the Netherlands on November 9th. That same day, the German Republic was proclaimed in Berlin. 2 days later, representatives of the new government signed an armistice in a railway carriage at Compiègne, France, effectively ending the fighting at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe was a continent of ruins. The toll was staggering. Over 9 million soldiers dead, 20 million wounded, and countless civilians killed by hunger, bombardment, or disease. Entire regions lay devastated, their towns reduced to rubble, their farmland cratered and poisoned by shell fire. Beyond the physical destruction, psychological scars ran deep. Veterans returned home haunted by trauma, their experiences incomprehensible to those who had stayed behind. The term shell shock, an early recognition of psychological injury, entered the medical lexicon as societies struggled to cope with invisible wounds. In the weeks following the armistice, millions of soldiers began the long journey home. For some, the return was a joyful reunion. For others, it meant confronting unemployment, poverty, and disillusionment. Governments faced immense challenges: demobilizing armies, rebuilding economies, and caring for the wounded. Refugees wandered across borders, and in many regions, hunger persisted. The Spanish flu pandemic, which had begun during the war and spread through troop movements, now swept across the globe, killing tens of millions, far more than the fighting itself. The line between war and peace blurred as states struggled to restore order amid social and political upheaval. The collapse of empires reshaped the map of Europe and the Middle East. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into a patchwork of new nation-states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, each grappling with ethnic tensions and economic hardship. The Ottoman Empire, stripped of its Arab provinces, faced occupation and internal revolt. From its ruins would emerge the modern Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The Russian Empire had already been transformed by revolution, plunging into civil war between red and white factions. Even the victors were exhausted. Britain and France, though triumphant, were financially drained and politically divided. The illusion of European invincibility had been shattered. In Paris, peace negotiations began in January 1919, drawing delegates from over 30 nations. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed in June, sought to establish a new international order, but instead sowed the seeds of future conflict. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war and to pay enormous reparations. Its colonies were seized, its army reduced, and key territories, Alsace-Lorraine, the Polish corridor, the Rhineland, were stripped away or occupied. Germans viewed the treaty as a humiliation, and resentment soon became a powerful political force. The Austrian and Ottoman settlements were similarly punitive, redrawing borders with little regard for ethnic realities, while the new states of Eastern Europe faced fragile legitimacy and disputed frontiers. President Wilson's idealistic vision of a League of Nations was intended to preserve peace through collective security and diplomacy. Yet the League's authority was limited, and the United States, ironically, refused to join after the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty. Without American participation, the League lacked credibility and enforcement power. Still, the idea of international cooperation had been planted, a hopeful legacy amid the ruins. Many people believed the horrors of the Great War would ensure that no such catastrophe could ever happen again, though history would soon prove otherwise. For those who had lived through the war, the experience defied comprehension. Writers, artists, and intellectuals grappled with its meaning, giving rise to a new cultural era often defined by disillusionment. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the novels of Éric Maria Remarque and Henri Barbusse, and the haunting art of Otto Dix, all captured the sense of loss and futility that haunted the post-war generation. Faith in progress and reason, ideals that had animated the 19th century, was deeply shaken. The modernist movement in literature and art, with its fragmented forms and skepticism toward traditional values, emerged directly from this crisis of meaning. In politics, the war's legacy was equally profound. The collapse of monarchies in Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary gave rise to republics, but democracy's survival was fragile. Economic instability, inflation, and unemployment fueled extremist movements from both left and right. In Germany, veterans and civilians alike searched for scapegoats, nurturing the stab-in-the-back myth that blamed defeat on internal betrayal rather than military failure. These resentments would later feed the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, linking the tragedy of World War I to the even greater catastrophe of World War II. In social terms, the war accelerated transformations already underway. Women, having entered the workforce in vast numbers, demanded political rights in recognition of their contributions. Suffrage movements gained victories in several countries, including Britain, the United States, and Germany, though equality remained elusive. Class structures shifted as returning soldiers sought fairer treatment, and workers organized for better conditions. The shared trauma of the trenches also weakened old distinctions of rank and privilege. Yet progress was uneven, and in many places, reactionary forces sought to restore pre-war hierarchies. The psychological toll of the war endured long after the last battles. Memorials rose in cities and villages across Europe, inscribed with the names of the fallen. The concept of the unknown soldier, buried in solemn ceremony, symbolized both collective mourning and the anonymity of modern death. Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, and other commemorations sought to give meaning to loss, even as veterans struggled with the silent aftermath of combat. For millions, the war had destroyed not only lives, but faith in the stability of civilization itself. The years that followed the end of World War I were a mixture of exhaustion, reconstruction, and profound uncertainty. Though the guns had fallen silent, the world was far from peace. The psychological and political aftershocks of the conflict radiated outward, shaping the 20th century in ways that few could yet imagine. The Great War, as contemporaries called it, was both an ending and a beginning. The end of the old European order and the beginning of a new, unstable era defined by ideological struggle, economic upheaval, and the lingering memory of catastrophe. In the immediate aftermath, the victors faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Cities such as Ypres, Verdun, and Reims were reduced to rubble, while vast regions of farmland lay poisoned by unexploded shells and chemicals. Millions of refugees sought homes in new or unfamiliar nations, often carrying only memories of what had been lost. Governments established programs to reconstruct infrastructure, compensate veterans, and provide for widows and orphans. Yet, the financial burden was immense. Many European economies teetered on the brink of collapse, their debts compounded by war loans and reparations. Inflation eroded savings. In Germany, by the early 1920s, it spiraled into hyperinflation that rendered money almost worthless. Ordinary citizens, already traumatized by war, now faced economic chaos. The political landscape of Europe was equally unstable. The collapse of four great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, created a vacuum that new states rushed to fill. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born from the wreckage of Austria-Hungary, while Poland re-emerged after more than a century of partition. Yet these new nations inherited complex ethnic mosaics and contested borders, leading to internal tensions and diplomatic friction. In the Middle East, British and French mandates carved artificial boundaries across former Ottoman lands, setting the stage for future conflicts. The colonial powers justified their control with promises of tutelage and progress. But for many in the Arab world, it was a bitter betrayal of wartime assurances of independence. For Britain and France, victory brought both pride and decline. Their global empires had reached new territorial heights, but at staggering human and financial cost. Britain faced mounting debts to the United States and a population weary of sacrifice. In Ireland, long-simmering nationalist resentment erupted into revolution and civil war. leading to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. France, though victorious, was haunted by demographic loss and the fear of another German resurgence. The French countryside remained scarred by trenches and craters, silent witnesses to the price of survival. The desire for security led to the construction of the Maginot Line and a reliance on the Treaty of Versailles as a bulwark against future aggression, an illusion that would prove tragically misplaced. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged from the war as a global power, but retreated into a mood of cautious isolation. Having suffered comparatively few casualties and enjoyed economic gains from wartime production, America faced a choice between engagement and withdrawal. President Wilson's idealism found little support at home. The Senate's rejection of the League of Nations symbolized a nation turning inward. Yet American influence persisted through finance and culture. In the 1920s, U.S. loans underpinned European recovery, and American consumer goods, music, and films flowed across the Atlantic. The war had shifted the balance of global power, even if Americans themselves were reluctant to recognize it. The human dimension of post-war life was marked by grief and remembrance. Nearly every town in Europe had its monuments to the fallen, each name representing a life cut short. The rituals of mourning became central to national identity. Annual ceremonies on November 11th, Armistice Day, were occasions of both solemnity and unity. Yet beneath the surface, there lingered resentment, disillusionment, and unhealed wounds. Veterans organizations demanded recognition and support, while war widows and orphans struggled to survive. In literature and art, the sense of a lost generation captured the mood of futility and alienation. The war had promised glory and delivered mechanized slaughter. It had been fought for ideals that seemed hollow in retrospect. Intellectually and culturally, the Great War shattered the optimism of the 19th century. Faith in progress, science, and rationality gave way to cynicism and existential doubt. The war's unprecedented scale of killing suggested that civilization itself was fragile. Artists and writers sought new forms to express this rupture. The Dada movement mocked the absurdity of modern life. Surrealism delved into the subconscious to find meaning amid chaos. In literature, figures like T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf broke from traditional narrative structures, reflecting the fractured consciousness of the age. Philosophers questioned the very foundations of Western thought, while scientists grappled with the moral implications of technological power unleashed for destruction. At the same time, the war accelerated social transformations that would define the modern world. Women's wartime labor had demonstrated their competence in fields once reserved for men. In many countries, this translated into expanded political rights. British women over 30 gained the vote in 1918, with full equality following a decade later. American women won suffrage in 1920. Though inequality persisted, the war had permanently altered gender expectations. Similarly, labor movements gained momentum as workers demanded fair wages, shorter hours, and recognition of unions. Governments, fearing revolution like that in Russia, introduced social welfare measures that marked the beginnings of the modern welfare state. Outside Europe, the war's effects rippled through colonial empires. Millions of colonial subjects had fought or labored for the Allies, often believing their loyalty would earn political concessions. In India, returning soldiers and activists alike pressed for self-government, inspiring mass movements led by figures such as Mohandas Gandhi. In Africa and the Caribbean, veterans questioned imperial authority and racial hierarchies. The rhetoric of self-determination, popularized by Wilson's 14 Points, resonated far beyond its limited application in Europe. Though the colonial system remained intact, its moral foundations were eroding. The seeds of decolonization had been planted. Economically, the war transformed global systems of production, trade, and finance. It accelerated mechanization and the use of chemical and electrical technologies, while wartime demands spurred advances in medicine, communication, and transportation. Yet the disruption of trade routes and the debts accumulated by European powers shifted financial dominance to the United States. The 1920s saw brief prosperity, but the underlying instability, war debts, reparations, and interdependence created a fragile global economy that would collapse in 1929 with the Great Depression. Many historians later viewed that economic crisis as an indirect continuation of the Great War, exposing unresolved structural weaknesses and rekindling nationalist resentment. Politically, the peace settlements left a divided world. In Eastern Europe, fragile democracies struggled to survive amid ethnic conflict and economic hardship. In Italy, nationalist frustration over mutilated victory contributed to the rise of Benito Mussolini's fascist movement. In Germany, the Weimar Republic inherited the impossible task of maintaining democracy under the shadow of defeat, reparations, and political extremism. The combination of humiliation, poverty, and fear created fertile ground for authoritarianism. Thus, the war that was supposed to end all wars instead laid the foundation for another, even more devastating conflict. Beyond Europe, the global consequences were equally significant. The war had demonstrated the vulnerability of empires and the power of industrialized nations. Japan, having fought on the Allied side, gained territory in the Pacific and greater influence in Asia, setting it on a path toward imperial expansion. In the United States, the war marked the country's emergence as a creditor nation and industrial leader, though its reluctance to assume global responsibility would later complicate efforts to maintain peace. In the Middle East, the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire created mandates under British and French control, sowing the seeds of modern conflicts in Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. The arbitrary lines drawn by the victors ignored local identities and aspirations, ensuring that the war's legacy would echo for generations. Spiritually and philosophically, humanity was forced to confront its capacity for self-destruction. The mechanized slaughter of millions raised questions about the direction of modern civilization. The same technologies that had powered progress, factories, chemistry, engineering, had also produced machine guns, poison gas, and mass bombardment. The war had revealed that reason and science, when divorced from moral restraint, could become instruments of annihilation. In this sense, World War I marked not only a political and social rupture, but also a moral one. It challenged faith in human nature and the idea that progress was inevitable. Yet amid the devastation, some found hope in reconstruction and renewal. Humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross expanded their reach. International cooperation, though fragile, persisted in efforts to address refugees, health crises, and disarmament. The 1920s and early 1930s witnessed cultural flourishing even amid turmoil. The Jazz Age, cinema, new architecture, and modern design offered glimpses of vitality. The memory of war inspired pacifist movements and calls for reconciliation, though these aspirations would soon collide with the realities of a world drifting toward another confrontation. In retrospect, the Great War stands as both a warning and a mirror. It revealed the dangers of unchecked nationalism, militarism, and imperial ambition, but it also reflected the contradictions of modernity itself. The same forces that had created unprecedented prosperity and scientific achievement had also unleashed unparalleled destruction. The war demonstrated how fragile civilization could be when pride, fear, and ideology overwhelmed reason and empathy. Its legacy is visible not only in the political boundaries and institutions that followed, but in the collective consciousness of humanity, a recognition that progress carries peril, and that peace requires constant vigilance. When the war began in the summer of 1914, few imagined it would reshape the world. By its end in 1918, empires had fallen, societies had been transformed, and millions lay dead. The hopes that the war would be the war to end all wars proved tragically false. Yet the experience compelled nations to rethink their assumptions about power, justice, and human responsibility. World War I was not simply a conflict of armies. It was a confrontation between eras. The 19th century's confidence in order and the 20th century's confidence in order century's descent into uncertainty. Its echoes continue to shape the modern world, reminding us that even in the ruins of war, the search for meaning and peace endures.